So welcome everyone, Kia ora koutou. Welcome to our campus seminar in 22, another one. And this one we have Professor Jay Marlowe and Dr. Bernard, becoming Dr. Bernard Samo, to present us their recent work on a safe start for asylum seekers and a fair future for convention refugees. Bernard just came to New Zealand. Bernard came to New Zealand more than 10 years ago from the southern Cameroons, seeking protection as a refugee, was formally recognized as a refugee, and is now a New Zealand citizen. He's close to completing his PhD at the University of Auckland, supervised by Professor Jay Marlowe and Dr. Anna Hood. He chairs the Asylum Seekers Trust, Support Trust, and is a cultural advisory member for refugees as survivors in New Zealand. Jay is a professor of social work and co-director of the Center for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies at the University of Auckland. In 2019, he became a Rutherford Discovery Fellow to pursue a 5-year research program related to refugee settlement trajectories. And he's also a social worker and former visiting fellow with the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford University. He's worked with refugee communities as a practitioner and a researcher and published more than 80 peer-reviewed papers.
So, e nā rangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, no te whenua o America aho, no te rohe o North Carolina, ko te iwi taketake, ko te Cherokee, ko te New River te awa, ko Grandfather Mountain te monga, I mori tō ai, taku nako, ko Jay Marlowe toku ingoa. Thank you for the introduction, Erzu, and for the opportunity to present. And so I think you've probably said enough about me. So I don't know, Bernard, is there anything else that you want to say about yourself before we get underway?
No, I am good, thank you.
So thank you for attending this talk or for listening to it on a later recording. And basically what we're wanting to present is a report entitled Safe Start, Fair Future, Refugee Equality, which represents a collaboration between the Center for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies and the Asylum Seeker Support Trust. I do want to emphasize that within that, there's actually Bernard and I are both authors on the publication, but there's multiple other people who we acknowledge at the very end who were also authors on the report. So what we're looking to do is to focus on this idea of a safe start for asylum seekers and a fair future for all refugees. And we're going to break the presentation up into 2 different parts. So Bernard will be speaking about the safe start for asylum seekers and the importance of resourcing them as they go through the refugee status determination process. And then I'll then focus on a fair future for all refugees. We'll start off with just some very brief sort of contextual elements, and then we'll move into the report itself. So, so if we think about what's in a name, well, there's a lot in a name for New Zealand, because depending on how you arrive as a forced migrant into New Zealand matters. And so we'll be talking about 3 main groups in this relatively short presentation. So the first is quota refugees, which are part of New Zealand's annual refugee resettlement program. And these are people that already have refugee status recognition before they come to New Zealand. They're nominated generally by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And then New Zealand selects up to, at the moment, up to 1,500 people a year. It was a program that started in 1987. It was increased from its historic numbers of 750 a year to 1,500 in 2020, though those numbers have never been, have yet to be realized because of various COVID restrictions. So those are quota refugees. They're people that already have that refugee status before they come to New Zealand. Then there are people that come to New Zealand that say that they're in need of protection, and because of a well-founded fear of persecution, they ask for refugee status recognition within New Zealand. And they start off as asylum seekers. They're effectively seeking asylum. They're seeking protection from that well-founded fear of persecution. And on average in New Zealand, just under 400 people over the last 10 years, just under 400 people a year have have applied for asylum once they're within New Zealand. So this might be someone who's come on a different visa, perhaps on a student visa or a work visa or something of that nature. And then once they're within New Zealand, they say they'd like to be recognized as a refugee. The reason they do that is because New Zealand is signatory to the 1951 Convention relating to refugees, which means that if someone has a well-founded fear of persecution, New Zealand can't send them back to where they're from. They have an obligation to protect them. For those asylum seekers, when they apply for refugee status determination, of those 394 people, they then go through a process of seeking refugee status determination. And if the Refugee Status Unit, Immigration Protection Tribunal, or perhaps the minister recognizes them as a refugee through various different pathways, they're called convention refugees. And on average, about 178 people per year become convention refugees in New Zealand. And basically what we're focusing on are those last two groups, and then comparing that to what rights and entitlements that quota refugees have that really paint a differential and a discriminatory pathways across these three groups. Did I get all that right, Bernard? Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
And so this relates to the report that we a lot of the data and the stuff that we'll be showing relates to the report that we co-wrote, of which also Arazu is also an author on. And this relates to the experiences of asylum seekers. And what we can sort of see, and Bernard will speak to these individually in just a minute, is that there are some things that relate to social welfare, work rights, housing, and so forth, where in some cases there are relatively good policies in terms of as they're stated within policy. But then we can sometimes also see that even though there might be supports and entitlements there, they may not be all that accessible in practice. And so we're going to unpack these things to show how and why these things matter. So Bernard, I might just pass it over to you.
Yes, thank you. And we thought it would be good to start with this quote from one of our participants that I interviewed for my PhD. And just a bit of background there. This process, the refugee status determination process, it's a journey that I have been through. And a lot of the conversation or discussion that we're having here in terms of the asylum seeking process, it's stuff that I can relate to, and it's been something that I've been passionate about in the past 6 or 7 years, advocating for change in this space because of my own experience of the process. And so what we thought here is that if we have this quote from this participant that I interviewed for my thesis, which also looks at how the New Zealand, the same process, the refugee status determination process could be improved, made safer and better for people who have come like me here and then found they need to claim asylum and went through the process and are successful. And there is one word we use here in terms of how we talked about asylum seekers. We use the word save. And that word save, it's a very big word, because the reason why people like me and many others from other backgrounds would flee where we come from to seek protection also is because we are looking for safety. And what we then find when we go through the refugee status determination process in New Zealand, which is the official government process that starts with the refugee status unit at Immigration New Zealand. And then if we are successful at that stage, we are recognized as a refugee. But if we are not successful, we then move up to the Immigration and Protection Tribunal for an appeal. Again, if we are not successful, there are chances that we can go up to the High Court and any other, even the highest court in New Zealand, even though those chances become more and more difficult as we advance to the higher level. But why it's important to be able to illustrate this is that it's a journey that can take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And for some people, it may mean that they try and they are unsuccessful, and then the circumstances in their home country change. Like I do have one of someone that I supported about 3 years ago. She was from Ethiopia, and as working with the Asylum Seeker Support Trust, I supported her. Her initial claim was declined. But when the government of Ethiopia launched a war on the Tigray region, it meant she was from the Tigray region. So her circumstances changed so dramatically that she was then successful on a second attempt. So these are processes that can sometimes take 4, 5, 6, or even more years for some people. But just to unpack this code that we have here from one of the participants that I interviewed, he said, I came to New Zealand 5 years ago, and life was not easy. It was very hard, and the treatment I got here was inhumane. I have been subjected to being in prison, and after my prison finished, I came under another prison. I call this an open prison because now I live in the community, but I do not have rights. I can't study, I can't work, I can't do many things in my life. Living on charity for a long time, in 3 years since 2017, feels painful and emotional. We have got a lot of psychological problems. It is really damaging. Coming here, we were expecting to see a country where we will be seen as human beings and not a country where we will be excluded in our rights as human beings. We don't have decent food. We don't have decent housing. Most of us become homeless. I have been homeless for 3 months. So there are quite a number of issues there where the participants has touched on, and we would get to see that individually as we move to the next slide. Thank you. So what we intend to do here is talk about asylum seekers' access to social welfare, work rights, housing, mental health services, education, and services out of Auckland. So we will be focusing the conversation in terms of the challenges that they face accessing these services, and then also looking at our recommendations from this report in terms of how these services could be improved. And our goal is really on how the process could be made safe, given that the people that come here are really and go through this process are looking for somewhere safe. And what we're advocating here in this report is not that everyone who comes through this process should be recognized as a refugee. That is not the purpose. If in fact we look through the data, what we see is that because people can claim and then circumstances change and they reclaim, actually somewhere between 60 to 70% of people that go through this process, whether at the initial level or through to the appeal or reclaiming, are ultimately recognized as refugees. So what that tells us is that more than 50% of the claimants will be recognized. So if we start treating them unfairly and not make the process safe, we are actually in a way discriminating or abusing people who actually are refugees in this process already. So that's great. Jay, it would be good if we move to the next slide. So the very first one here I have is access to social welfare. In terms of the policy for social welfare for asylum seekers, the policy actually makes it eligible that people who are going through the refugee status determination process and have a valid visa. That valid visa could be a work visa, it could be any type of temporal visa, for instance, a student visa or even an interim visa. They should be able to, they have entitlements to social welfare while they are going through that process. However, what we do know in the space of the work we've done in this research and even other research that has been published is that when asylum seekers that have this valid visa actually approach work and income to seek this help, often they face challenges. Either the staff that are there are not aware of this entitlement, so they turn people away that should be getting this entitlement. And then the next one is that there is also even a lack of knowledge within that spaces as to the rights of asylum seekers. And if I just may present a brief case there, I remember somewhere in 2015 2015. I supported someone from my community. She was from Cameroon, and then the lawyer linked her up to me with her family. So I supported her to work an income for her to access welfare. And during the process, the case officer really asked some questions that were really ridiculous. And that was why the lawyer insisted that I should take this family there, because these are things that the lawyers have been encountering over and over and trying for a very many years to change, but it's been very difficult. And so the officer started asking the claimant whether what is her claim about. And beside that, she even also asked that did this person come to New Zealand because they wanted to get access to social welfare? So at that point, I interrupted and said, these questions she shouldn't answer. The questions are not appropriate. We need to see the manager of the place. And then the manager then came, and fortunately, the case was approved. She got the welfare support that she needed and for her family. But what we see here is that this the challenges that asylum seekers face assessing welfare put people in a very precarious situations. For a lot of people, including even if I look back in my case, there were times that I lived with friends like beggars within my community, because it's when someone knows your situation, they might offer you a sofa where you could sleep or give you food. But really, this is not things that it should be that way. If we had the access to this welfare as the policy has prescribed. And what we also know is that where the services do exist, funding, the organization, for instance, like the Asylum Seeker Support Trust, which is based entirely in Auckland, the funding that they rely on and to support asylum seekers is often gotten from funders, donors. And so they live every year not knowing whether next year they will be in the business of supporting asylum seekers. So Jay, if that's okay, if we could go to the next slide. Yeah. So what we have here are two recommendations that we believe, if implemented by the government, can really make a difference here and makes this process really safe for asylum seekers. First, the government needs to ensure that there is access to temporal additional support via service providers, for instance, like the Asylum Seekers Support Trust, Aotearoa New Zealand. It could even be Red Cross, to allow people get the welfare that they need, including even, we don't know whether the issue, it's kind of really difficult sometimes to get into the space of MSD in terms of the welfare, because there could be a lot of politics there. But again, there needs to be some, we believe, specific training for the staff that are there, so that they understand the needs of asylum seekers, and they understand that when people come there for entitlements, they are not asked these other questions about their claims, and or they are not turned away when they actually need the support. Because if we think about someone like in my case, if I wanted to be more practical, when I got here, I did not know where I was living at the time. I did not know anyone from Cameroon. So if I had gone to Wings and they turned me around, that simply means I was straight going to live off the street, because I had no other support. And I did not claim asylum living in Auckland, where there was the Asylum Seeker Support Trust. So having this specific training and dedicated staff that work specifically for asylum seekers will make so much difference, because that could be the difference between someone getting a house and becoming homeless. Thank you. And here, work rights. Yeah, this one is a very big issue, but I'll start it with these quotes from, again, one of our female participants that I interviewed for my thesis, and we'll use it for the support. What she said was that something needs to be done, because I think the process for work visas delays a lot, to the point where you find some asylum seekers losing their jobs. Once they lose their jobs, they have no means of livelihood. They suffer financially. I think immigration has to consider our status as asylum seekers. First of all, we are living through stress, trauma, and the idea of not getting a source of income adds to it. Working itself is a way of relieving that stress. When someone applies for a work visa and it takes months and months to process, it affects not only their finance, but their psychology as well. So what we really would add here is that in terms of policy, immigration policy we're talking about here, there is provision there that when someone has got a valid claim for asylum in process, because we fill an application, we submit it to Immigration New Zealand, and you get usually a very quick reply from them saying that they acknowledge, which comes in the form of a letter acknowledging that you've lodged a claim. And if there are any issues, say for instance, if they think that claim in itself, from the face of it, it's got no grounds, they may highlight that issues. But once that letter comes acknowledging that you have a claim, it means we have a valid claim in the system, because immigration has not raised any issue about a claim apart from scheduling an interview maybe in some weeks or months ahead. And what immigration policy does say is that during that time, an asylum seeker should be entitled to some form of a visa, temporary visa, because having a claim in the system in New Zealand does not make you lawful in New Zealand, which is kind of absurd the way the policy has been written. What actually gives you lawful status and entitlement to services in the community is having a visa that accompanies that claim. And what we do believe here is that a work visa should be the best starting point, because that means for asylum seekers, for instance, we don't have to go to WINS to ask for social welfare, because for a lot of us, we just want to work and get a life. We don't have to go and, begging for WINS or go to even Housing New Zealand if we can work and pay for that. But what we also do know is that, as this client highlighted, is that it can take several months for that to be processed. So we will go next to the recommendation of what we think could be appropriate here. The very first point here is that I will not go in the order on the list, just start with the one that jumps at me first, is that we believe this process of work visas should be streamlined. In very appropriately, we feel three weeks should be the appropriate time. And this time frame that we've picked, it's not just coming from nowhere. It's not just from the space, but we also got it from a review of the refugee status branch. That is the processes and proceedings for determining refugee status, an independent review that the government did in 2019 of their processes. And it found that a lot of their processes are protracted. And during that protraction, it causes unnecessary stress and trauma or re-traumatization of people who are living in limbo in the community. So one of the strong recommendations is that these processes could be reduced, such that when people apply, they should get the results or the outcome that they need. So if they need to move on with their life, they can, rather than being stagnant in a process that they're waiting for a year, 2 or 3. So that it's within that framework that we feel 3 weeks will be good enough for people to get outcome for their work visas. And if that wasn't possible, let's say if immigration decided they don't want to give them a work visa for some reason because they feel like they're abusing the process or so, we still believe that people should be entitled to an interim visa, which gives them a lawful time here in New Zealand. And then it's for immigration to be able to still streamline their refugee status determination process to make sure that the person who is maybe the 1 or 2 people that are using this as a way of abusing the system do not have the opportunity of staying in this process for so long. Rather, if a decision is made within, let's say, 2 or 3 months or 6 months, then that person could then find a way to move on with their life. So as a basic principle, all people who have an asylum claim in process should have an opportunity to support themselves through work. That is the main argument here. So we could go to the next one if you're happy with that, Jay. And access to housing. Again, this is one of the policy where it's a bit confusing, and sometimes it's something that I experienced in particular. So I feel a bit frustrated sometimes still reading that. And I went through this process in 2008. So this is 2022. We're still talking about this. So it needed to have changed, I believe. But what we have here is that people who claim asylum are entitled to emergency grants for housing. And this is literally the government borrowing us money to go and find a place. If we couldn't get, let's say, for instance, you apply for a work visa, you get a work visa, but you couldn't get a job, or you're given, let's say, an interim visa, or even a visitor visa, or any kind of visa that does not allow you to work. So literally, I haven't made the decision not to work, but immigration has given me a visa that does not allow me to work. Then I turn up to WINS to ask for, to Housing New Zealand, to ask for support with housing. So I instead get money that that MSD borrows to me, which I have to repay back, and I don't have a job. So, and like in the case of the woman that I cited before, where I supported her and her family to MSD, she was actually given that type of money. I think she had it for about 4 or 6 months. And then when she started working, that money was being deducted. And that was really, really hard on her because she was just doing a part-time job and really struggling even on the job. So we do believe in this report that there needs to be funding capacity such that first, and it's and agree, and Jay, I believe you might have something to add here, but what I do believe is that people who have a valid claim and have a valid visa and turn up to MSD or to housing for housing support should not be borrowed. This money should not be given at a grant where they have to repay back. It should be supported because, again, this is a treaty that we've signed so that when people turn up to this beautiful country seeking help and support, we should treat them in that condition and support them. But what this means when asylum seekers are not able to access housing is that it leaves a lot of people without no means of housing, and they end up with private accommodation that it's quite expensive. And then services in Auckland that are dedicated, for instance, to asylum seekers, like the Asylum Seeker Support Trust, they are at full capacity most of the time, so they are not even able to provide. We are not even able to provide housing to a lot of the people that come knocking at our doors seeking help. So we go to the next. And
if I can just jump in, I mean, I think an important pointer on that as well, Bernard, is that New Zealand receives some of the fewest numbers of asylum seekers in the world. And a large part of that is because of the externalization of our borders, that we're surrounded by a lot of water. So we can have a lot of control about who's able to come into our borders or not. And so, and the fact that we're signatory to this convention is part of our, even meeting our obligations as an international partner in this global community and responding to increasing numbers of forced migrants worldwide. And these commitments that we're talking about are a very small drop in the bucket. We're not talking about many people here at all. And yet the government provides almost no support, very, very little funding at all. And particularly as it relates to dedicated funding for asylum seekers. And so these requests that we're making are just about a minimum standard of ensuring a safe process for people to apply for what they're legally entitled to do.
Thank you, Jay.
And then that was basically what I just said. It's provided that targeted funding during this critical time.
Brilliant. Thank you. And the next one now, it's access to mental health services. Again, what we do have in policy is that asylum seekers, like every other New Zealander would, if they have facing mental health challenges, should be able to work up to any government healthcare provider and get mental health services. But what we also know in practice is that this can become really very difficult, especially for the person who is still going through the asylum seeking process. And it's already, because what I did not highlight from the start is that the journey itself of applying for asylum and going through an asylum interview can be very re-traumatizing, because if you imagine that someone who has come all the way from, it could be from Ukraine, a practical example that's on, TV nowadays from that part of Ukraine where they're dropping bombs. They may have had their family members killed. They may have been tortured by Russian forces like we see highlighted on the news sometimes. And then they come here. It's not automatic that New Zealand would just give them refugee status. If they choose to go down this pathway, you have to go through the interview, you have to present your claim, present all this evidence. And these things can be really very re-traumatizing for people because we have to relive some of these traumatic experiences. And because we're coming from very different backgrounds where mental health for us, for instance, like for me as an African, can be seen very differently. The way I see mental illness is very different from the Western mainstream. And what we do see and I have uncovered in this report is that there is a lack of specialized or specialist mental health services to cater specifically for the needs of asylum seekers all over New Zealand. In Auckland, however, we do have RISE New Zealand, but again, RISE, like the other organizations that support refugees and asylum seekers, they are severely underfunded. So they do take asylum seekers in, I would say, as a matter of goodwill, because they don't really have a dedicated funding from the government that says, take this money and cater for these people and provide these services. So these can be very challenging, especially for an asylum seeker that will also at some point during this process of refugee status determination, seeking refugee status determination, will need like a psychological report from any of the psychologists, usually by RISE, to be able to support their claim. This can be really very challenging. And normally, this report should be funded by the legal aid system. But as we know, legal aid to New Zealand has been severely underfunded over the years. So for many people that sometimes do need the reports, like extra reports, do get their application for this mental health support during that process decline. So I think I've touched on that. And what we would like to see in this space is that the government should provide adequate resourcing of cross-cultural workers and community navigators to assist with access to mental health as well as general services. And also provide adequate and dedicated specialist mental health funding through RISE New Zealand to be able to support asylum seekers during this process of refugee status determination. Thank you. Access to education. This is the one place where I think I may be positive and not sound too negative and hard on the government. What we had initially when we were doing this report is that there was some disparity between the Ministry of Education, their policy, because their policy was quite clear that an asylum seeker and their family members who have valid visa in New Zealand can have access to primary, secondary, and tertiary education in New Zealand during that claim process. This is just a policy that they revised, I think, in 2020, and gave this entitlement. But from that period till we released our report in February this 2022, but by April 2022, the MSD also has done some changes in their policies to try to match some of these entitlements. Because the major thing is that even though the Ministry of Education had made it clear that people from asylum background could be able to access education at this different level, the question then is that for an asylum seeker who is already vulnerable, may not have a job or don't even have a place to stay, how could they access their education if there was no government support, for instance, except for usually English language classes? But in terms of, let's say, if someone wanted to come, for instance, to the University of Auckland, where I am today, to do a course on, it could be on any of the free, like social work, how are they able to access that if the government was not supporting them? So we've seen some movement in that space in April 2022, where MSD now has been able to match some of these things so that people from asylum seeking background, including those that have been recognized but are still waiting for their permanent residence, could be able to access student loan or student allowance, including their immediate family members in New Zealand that also have a valid visa. But however, we still have an issue there is that for the asylum seeker who has just been recognized, but their family members is still overseas, so then they have to apply. It could be their wife, that is their immediate family member, could be their partner or their children. They have to apply for a visa for this family member to join them here in New Zealand. The policy is still not very clear. And what we know when we're doing this report is that at the time, these people were treated as migrants, which means they had to be stood down for 3 years until they have lived in New Zealand for 3 years, and then they could become eligible. So that is where I think there still needs to be some work there to make it quite clear for them to be able to assess that. We good on that? Yes. So this is just an overall one and should be bringing it to an end. What we have here is that many people who claim asylum live in Auckland. About, I would say about, is it 60% or 75 or somewhere around there? Yes, so many people, 66% of asylum seekers live in Auckland. And in Auckland, we do not have much an issue about accessibility of services, community services that can support them, because we have Red Cross that really understands very well the situation of asylum seekers. We have RISE New Zealand, and then we have the Asylum Seeker Support Trust. But we, in this report, are concerned about the people that are out of Auckland, maybe the 20 or 30% or so that get live out of Auckland and go through this process. There is really no dedicated services for them. And that can become a serious issue. And that was my experience when I went through the process, because I was out of Auckland. So do we have a recommendation on that next? If there's, so what we have overall, the four main recommendation, which I would like you to take home from here, is that one, in terms of ensuring that asylum seekers are safe, if we know that, if we consider that safety is the main word which people come here to look for, government should adequately resource cross-cultural workers and community navigators to assist asylum seekers with access to entitled services. And then there should also be a funding for short-term accommodation services for those without access to this accommodation. There should also be specialist case workers at agencies, especially work and income, who are trained in asylum seeker and refugee policies. And lastly, government should ensure that there is a mobile support service for people residing out of Auckland, so they could get the help that they need during this process. I'll pass it over back to you, Jay, to continue now on the fair future part of our report. Yeah.
Kapai. Thanks, Bernard. Bernard presented sort of our six key elements related to a safe start for asylum seekers. For a fair future, we really just have sort of three main arguments that we want to present that relate to, again, the 178 people a year on average that are recognized as convention refugees, really with the idea that a refugee is a refugee. We should treat them the same. They should have the same rights and entitlements as any other refugee. And we appreciate that for convention refugees, they may have had a different pathway than that of a quota refugee, but that on a policy level, we should be allowing the individual to decide what access to supports and entitlements that they need, because we're not talking about a homogenous group. There are actually differences, and there might be some people that are convention refugees that don't need these supports and access, but there are certainly others that would benefit, and this would be a benefit to them and to the wider society if they're able to access these services. And so I want to break this down in relation to just three main recommendations. So the first is that the inclusion of all people with refugee status recognition are included in the New Zealand Refugee Resettlement Strategy. So in 2012, the government proposed a whole of government approach to ensuring that refugees are able to integrate effectively into the fabric of New Zealand life. And so basically, they took this recommendation to Cabinet, and Cabinet approved the strategy, but they only approved it for quota refugees. And in 2012 said that the intent was that it would eventually be open to all refugees, but yet a decade later, that aspiration remains precarious and something that hasn't been realized. The refugee resettlement strategy is currently under review by the government, and in fact, they're even doing some co-design workshops in the coming weeks to look at what a refresh of the strategy might look like. And this does include within the terms of reference whether or not to include convention refugees and even indeed asylum seekers within that strategy. And why that matters is that the strategy articulates sort of 5 main aims or arms of the strategy that look to sort of achieve sort of participation, health and well-being, education, housing, and self-sufficiency, which predominantly focuses on employment and work. And these together provide a more holistic appreciation of what constitutes integration and belonging in New Zealand society. And why this matters is that this strategy actually provides almost a language around through which maybe certain resources can flow to support people from refugee backgrounds, but it also relates to the indicators that the government uses to measure success. So you can Google the refugee data dashboard, and you can see it on various years, the ways in which the government creates different indicators and measures in relation to these 5 different outcome areas to show the ways in which refugees are able to integrate into New Zealand life. However, this only relates to quota refugees. So again, what we're arguing is that this should be open to all refugees, not just quota refugees. And the way that and one of the things around this that I think is really important to recognize is that by virtue of being in New Zealand, for all quota refugees, they start off once they arrive on New Zealand shore, they're immediately a permanent resident. Convention refugees, so asylum seekers, however, they apply for refugee status recognition. If they're granted that, they become a convention refugee and they become a resident. And then after a period of time, they can apply for a permanent resident. And so because of this, generally, you can say that people can access certain rights, such as the right to education, the right to health, the right to work, because these are generally available to the wider public. But when we start to drill down onto those different rights in terms of are they accessible, are they adaptable, and are they acceptable, what we start to realize is that for groups that sit outside the dominant mainstream, those that might be from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds, various forced migration histories, as it might relate to disability, or other various social locations, is that these rights to health, the right to education, the right to work, the right to housing, for instance, can start to fall over when we start to think about the accessibility, the adaptability, the acceptability. And this relates to the 4A standards analysis, where it uses those 4 A's that was developed by Katerina Tomaevsky. She developed it originally in relation to the right to education. It starts to show the various ways in which when diversity starts to experience these different rights, how it can create differential and even discriminatory pathways and experiences. And so this is really what I was just sort of saying, was that, yes, you might be able to say that yes, there is access, that education is available in New Zealand. So therefore that right to education is realized. But again, once we sort of apply these other 3 A's to it, you start to realize that it isn't the same. So if I can just back up again, to the first recommendation, which is the inclusion of all people in the refugee resettlement strategy, that's largely about trying to level the playing field so that actually that a refugee is a refugee, we should treat them the same. So convention refugees and quota refugees should be given the same rights and entitlements and access. Once that level playing field is realized, this is where we can start to think about improving the playing field. And this is where that 4A standards analysis can be very useful. The Human Rights Commission has done a similar report in 2010 that looked at a range of rights across New Zealand, across many different diverse groups, to show the ways in which New Zealand is realizing these rights, or where they're potentially not, or where they could actually improve upon. And this is just an example within the right to education that Tomaevsky actually operationalized the ways in which we understand availability, accessibility, acceptability, and adaptability. And within that, what we can just start to see is that these 4 A's can be mutually reinforcing, and as you start to improve one, it can improve the other ones. And a colleague and I actually wrote a paper in 2016 that used a 4A standards analysis as it relates to the right to education, work, and health within New Zealand. And I'd be happy to provide that at another time. If you just wanted to send me an email, I'd be happy to provide that to you. So those are the first 2 recommendations. The last one is about streamlining permanent residency. And so I've already just mentioned that for quota refugees, they're a permanent resident on arrival, whereas convention refugees have to apply for permanent residency. And why this is important is it not only provides greater access to certain rights and entitlements, but it also provides a sense of surety. That if we think that forced migration is something that creates a lot of uncertainty, it makes it difficult to plan one's life or how they might pursue their hopes and dreams for themselves and their families, permanent residency provides that sense that, that there's that lasting protection. But what we can start to see is that there are increasing lags in the time to apply for permanent residency for convention refugees. That 50% of the applications from a decade ago, the waiting times have increased 7-fold, and 90% of the applications has increased 3-fold. So we can even sort of look at that just in terms of this graph here, which Arazu sourced this data through the integrated data infrastructure. But really just want to sort of show here again is that we can see that 50% of the applications, within 2011 were determined in just over 2 months. Fast forward to a decade later, 428 days, 50% of applications. So again, we're thinking about people that are looking for certainty around their health and well-being, and about these protracted waiting times to have that surety. And again, you can see that again for 90% of applications on the right-hand side. Now, one of the things to emphasize within the refugee status determination process is that people undergo very rigorous and stringent checks, security checks, and that sort of thing. And so when people actually apply for permanent residency, what we can actually see is that almost everyone, and in some cases, actually everyone, that when they apply for permanent residency, these claims are approved. So the actual need to have these prolonged waiting times, we argue, is not needed. The security checks have already been undergone. And so that really, this is something that could be fast-tracked. So again, just our fair recommendations is the inclusion of people with refugee status in the New Zealand Refugee Resettlement Strategy to level the playing field. And then secondly is to improve that playing field, to ensure that the supports are available, accessible, adaptable, and acceptable. And finally, to streamline that permanent residency or that residency to help refugees settle and participate meaningfully in New Zealand society. So Safe Start Fair Future report, you can go to the Center for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies website to download it, or feel free to even email me. I'd be happy to provide that to you. We launched this report at Parliament back in May, and we continue to work with the government around trying to ensure that these recommendations are translated into policy, and also trying to participate in the refresh of the refugee resettlement strategy to also ensure that some of these recommendations that we make are realized. I'd also just like to also direct you that we recently released another report which is about a rainbow refugee quota, which you can also access at the link provided below. So that's really it from me. That's the Safe Start Fair Future. Is there anything that you'd like to say, Bernard?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, well, look, I will just conclude with a karakia, and then if there's any questions or comments, I'm very happy to take them, or Bernard and I are happy to take them at that point. So, unahia, 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 ki te uru tapu nui, ki Aotearoa, ki mama, te nā ko, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara takata. Koia ra I rongo, whakaaria, ake ki runga, kia tina, tina, huye, Thank you for listening, and happy to have further discussion if that's what any of you would like to do. Kia ora.
Yeah, thank you, Jay and Bernard. Is there any question audience want to ask? I have a question if nobody has right now. Bernard, this question is for you. So you said for the process of asylum seeking, 3 weeks is mentioned somewhere in the law. Is that right? I mean, it is supposed to take 3 weeks, really, and it's taken like 8-9 years, and many more years in some special cases. Is that right?
Yes, not actually 3 weeks, but there is a leaflet that has been designed by Immigration, the Refugee Status Unit of Immigration New Zealand. It sort of lays out this process that if you submit a claim, for instance, you should expect maybe to hear back from immigration to confirm your claim maybe within a week or two. I'm not quite sure of that because I haven't checked it for some time now. And then after that, it might take again another month or so, 6 weeks to get an interview. And then so they've really laid out this process to get it work within like 3 months or something like 3 to 6 months. But usually we know because of capacity issues and all of that, sometimes it can take longer than that. For some people, it takes up to a year. And that's why in this recommendation, we're asking that the government should also look at funding the RSU, so that is the Refugee Status Unit of Immigration New Zealand, so they can be able to meet these time frames that they have set out. Yeah. And for many of us, when we claim asylum, when we have that time frame, that's what we're really looking at, expecting to get the process done within 3 to 6 months. But it's,
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So, yeah, this question is from Han. What are the reasons for different treatment between conventional and quota refugees? What do you think?
I think that'll be a good one for Jay.
I think it's a really important question, and I think, I mean, if we look at it on face value, I mean, if you think about we're talking about short-term support for long-term gains in terms of, people's settlement outcomes and trying to support people. And I think I think one of the main reasons that we see this differential and discriminatory landscape is because of the moral panic that's been created about asylum seekers, or we even think about across the Tasman into Australia around, this fear of boat people and that sort of thing. And so a lot of this is actually about trying to sort of trying to show that we're protecting our borders and these sorts of things, without actually sort of recognizing that the amount of money that the Australian government, for instance, has spent on externalizing its borders, in the billions, that if they had spent even a fraction on that and integrating those people into the community, it would be better outcomes for Australia, and there'd be more money, taxpayer money. But part of this is about sort of the ways in which immigration, and particularly seeking asylum, can be a very heated political topic. And governments have even, in elections, governments have even come into power through some of the moral panic that's created around these things. So I actually think that some of the reasons why we have these discriminatory pathways is precisely because of this moral panic about asylum that's largely unfounded. And if we think about New Zealand, we haven't even had a boat arrive unassisted in modern times.
Yeah, so my question is whether we still have people put in prison, and is there any like proven document that like Migration New Zealand or whoever is making these decisions have against any asylum seeker to actually treat them like this and put them in prison? Do we have still people in detention?
I could answer that one because we're doing some work in that space. In this 2022 in May, that is last year, the government did an independent review of that process of detention of asylum seekers, and the findings of that review was released in May 2022, and that review really criticized the process why we're putting people, and the reasons, you know, it says those reasons are unjustified under international law, which are conventions that New Zealand has signed, and even domestic law like the Bill of Rights, and even case law. So following that review, the government then came out and announced that it would stop the practice, and it would also implement all the recommendations in the review, and also change the law in the Immigration Act to make sure that it conforms to these international treaties that we've signed. And we have seen some good movement, positive movement in the sense that some of the people that were in detention, 1 or 2 or 3 at the time, were immediately released following that review, and others that have arrived after me that under the former, you know, the old system before this review, they would normally be somewhere now in Mount Eden. They also have not been kept there. They've been sent to the Asylum Seeker Support Trust. However, there is still so much that needs to be done, because right now what we see is just more like, I would call cosmetic solutions, because the law hasn't been changed. The law is still there, and you could get a different government tomorrow and the old practice would come back, or even a different minister, or even at the immigration level. So what we would really like to see in this space is a law change to the Immigration Act as indicated, and even a change of culture. Because what we must remember here is that New Zealand has inherited this culture of being punitive on these people, you know, that come to claim asylum. And sometimes the reason why someone is sent to Mount Eden prison is not because they have committed any crime where they're coming from, but it's more because, for instance, they look like a Muslim, so they could potentially be a terrorist, or they have a turn up without a proper visa or an identity card. But again, the Refugee Convention that we've signed to, and it states quite clearly that for someone who truly will be running away from some of these wars, conflicts, or persecution, they don't usually would have time to go through the normal processes of migration, to get a visa, get a travel document, all of that to travel. So the reason that they turn up to your border without a valid document should not be an excuse to throw them in prison. Actually, that speaks in itself that they are very likely a refugee. So those are some of the justification that they use, but it's inheriting the post-September 11 culture from the September 11 terrorist attack, where certain people now are always still seen as potential terrorists and just throw them in prison, even if there is anything to justify that or not. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And it's almost 1, so there's the last question. Would you like to answer that, Jay, before we finish this session? Yeah, and this is from Han again. Are there many convention refugees doing well in New Zealand and could act as role models?
Well, I mean, you're looking at Bernard Sama right here. I think he is a ringing endorsement of why we should celebrate the fact that we are signatory to the Refugee Convention, where people can make meaningful contributions to New Zealand life. There have been other economists that have done work that, provided that a resettlement country provides an investment in welcoming people from refugee backgrounds, they can actually become cost positive to society. And that's in terms of economic benefits, but also just in terms of the ways in which they contribute to the wider social fabric of our lives. And so I think there are many examples of convention refugees that make meaningful contributions to New Zealand, and I think that's something that should be celebrated. And I also think that we should be celebrating the fact that we are also responding to what is a global crisis in terms of forced migration numbers, that we're actually meeting also our humanitarian commitments to ensure that, you know, that we're an international partner in responding to this global problem.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you for presenting this great work and for the discussion that it followed. Hope to see you soon again.